Think back with me, if you would, to the events of this past summer in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I live. It's August 12th. It's in the morning, and it's hot, and it's crowded, and it's tense. And I'm standing on a street in front of one of our local parks with my two teenage children. You know, it's the day of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where thousands have descended upon our small college town to protest the removal of a Confederate statue, but also to rally the nation to their brand of white nationalism. I've come with my kids in what we hope will be nonviolent counter-demonstration. But as you all know, that's not what happens. Before us stand paramilitiamen with fully armed semi-automatic weapons, and behind them, waves of alt-right demonstrators file into the park with a monument. They come marching down one of our main streets, past our city hall, past our public library, past local churches and our synagogue. As they come, many of them are waving flags with swastikas. They come chanting things like blood and soil, and Jews will not replace us. They come wearing helmets, wielding shields and clubs, clearly ready for a fight. Now, all I can think of as I'm standing there next to my kids is it's 2017 in the United States of America, and there are self-proclaimed Nazis and KKK marching down our streets. The questions from my kids inevitably come, Dad, what is happening? What should we do? And later, Dad, is there hope for our country? These are haunting questions to be asked by one's kids, and I've wrestled with them ever since. But it turns out I'm also a sociologist who studies civic life in America. And I'm convinced that these questions are not just mine as a parent and not just mine as a resident of Charlottesville. These are all our questions. These are questions, moreover, that the answers to which forms nothing less than our generation's grand challenge. At the heart of that challenge is how we collectively will figure out ways to mend a fraying and tattered social fabric and reforge a common civic life in which all Americans can thrive. Now, for reasons which I hope will become clear, the place we're going to have to begin that search is on the streets of our cities and our metros. And the most promising places to look are in America's great underdog cities like Memphis. Now, why? For that reason, we'll have to answer these three questions my kids asked. So first, Dad, what is happening? Now, to be honest, I'm still grappling and trying to make sense of what happened that morning. Of course, as a sociologist, I am well acquainted with the long history of white supremacy in this country. But that's all academic. It's not personal. On August 12th, it was the first time that I, a highly educated and relatively privileged white man, experienced in a small and momentary way what I know others have experienced chronically and for generations. Now, as important as that has been for me personally, as a revelation about myself and the society I live in, it still doesn't explain why it's happening now, at this moment in our history. Very simply, we are experiencing the growing pains and the fault lines of an America that is struggling to come into being, the next America. We all know the basic facts. As a society, we're becoming more and more diverse. For the first time in the history of this country, we are going to be a majority-minority society, and that can be a powerfully great thing. But at the same time, as a society, we're becoming more and more disconnected from one another, seemingly every day. We're experiencing the greatest levels of economic inequality since the Great Depression, and many Americans are sorting themselves into neighborhoods and social media bubbles in which they only live and interact with people just like themselves. As a society, it is no wonder that we are becoming more distrustful and more polarized. And all of this is happening at the very same time that we are becoming less and less rural and more urban, which means that our cities are now becoming ground zero for how we will address these fault lines and growing pains And how we do so will bear on our own lives, the lives of our children, and our entire society. Now, this begs that second question my kids asked me that morning. Dad, what should we do? Well, it turns out I'd been wrestling with that question since 2012, when some colleagues and I started something called the Thriving Cities Project at the University of Virginia. Its mission was to help cities answer this question. And over the years, we've traveled to cities all across the country, and with every place we've gone and everything we've learned, it has brought us step by step to seeing the promise of the urban underdogs. Now, the first step in that process led us to a rather unexpected starting spot. It didn't take us to a city, it took us to a national park. You see, I grew up in Montana, just north of Yellowstone Park. And I was always fascinated growing up by how big, complex ecosystems worked. And I began to see a parallel between how big, complex human ecosystems, like cities, worked. The occasion for this insight came in what we like to call the parable of the wolves. Here's how it goes. In 1926, hunters killed the last known wolf in Yellowstone. And this set off a chain reaction of effects that rippled across the park's ecosystem and wouldn't be fully understood for 70 years. It turns out that the loss of the wolves was connected to the disappearance of the once abundant willows and aspen groves that used to dot the landscape because of overgrazing by elk and deer. That created problems for the smaller animals and the birds who used to live in them. It meant less wood for beavers, which in turn meant fewer dams, upon which many aquatic species depended. Meanwhile, 70 years of soil erosion actually changed the physical geography of the park as the rivers and streams changed their courses. Now, in 1995, with a great deal of controversy, wolves were reintroduced to the park. And while scientists remain divided about just how much credit to give that reintroduction, no one disputes that their 70-year absence played havoc in the park and that their reintroduction has played some role in bringing back the remarkable biodiversity of the park's ecosystem. Now, you may be wondering, what is this interesting story about wolves? What does this tell us about cities? I'll tell you. There are two lessons from the parable. The first is that a city is best understood as a human ecology. In a city, like in nature, everything is interconnected. Now, some of these connections will be obvious to us. We know, for example, that a strong school system is connected to a strong and healthy economy and tax base, but also to strong families and strong neighborhoods. Other connections are harder to see. We are just now learning the connection, for example, between early childhood stress, known as toxic stress, and educational outcomes, or between air quality and violent crime, or between how even a small change in the size of a city block can have incredible impacts on the city's walkability, which is in turn connected to things like obesity rates. But the parable teaches us another thing. That is what to do when something goes wrong in a human ecology like a city, when some key input goes missing or gets distorted. Like the biologists in Yellowstone, we have to identify that key input and figure out ways to restore it. We have to, in short, look for the wolves. So my colleagues and I, we set off from Yellowstone Park to cities and to look for the wolves. We began to go to those cities that seemed to be getting a lot of things right. Not everything, but a lot of things. All those cities that top the best of categories. Best quality of life, best place to retire, best place to open a coffee shop. Here's what we learned. While there is no single recipe for success, there are crucial ingredients that prove important time and again to the health of the ecologies of these cities. Here are three. First, active anchor institutions. Every community has a set of institutions like hospitals and universities, faith communities, key businesses, parks, which are not just anchored in their communities, but anchors of their communities. Think about how here in Memphis, your hospitals and universities are some of the largest employers, largest land developers, and talent attractors across the city. And we know how important these are when something goes wrong with one of them. Think back to what happened when that old Sears distribution center closed its doors in Midtown back in the early 1990s. That wasn't just a loss for the people who worked there. That was a loss for all of the neighborhoods that surrounded it. So we know how important these things are. But we also learned that there are other key ingredients, and here's our second one: unusual coalitions. Unusual coalitions. This occurs when anchor institutions and other groups begin to do the hard work of learning how to work together in uncommon ways to achieve common goods. They're unusual precisely because they are not easy and they are hard. They can only emerge out of relationships built on trust, and only when people are willing to engage one another, not just civilly, but equitably. Unusual coalitions turn out to be at the heart of almost all the most inspiring and transformative things we saw in these trend-setting cities. So for example, in Portland, Oregon, arguably one of the most secular cities in America, we saw an unusual coalition form between a public school system and evangelical churches around school boostership and student mentoring. In another instance, we saw an unusual coalition form between white bicycle advocates and black community organizers around community development strategies that weren't just good for cycling through the town, but also were socially just. Now, precisely because unusual coalitions take time and intent to build, we discovered a third key ingredient: generationally minded leadership. Everything that is of good and lasting import in a city can be traced back to decisions of leaders that were made long ago and didn't benefit them in an immediate sense. Now, this goes against our culture's election cycle mindset, but it can have huge payoffs. Again, Portland provides an interesting example. Back in 1979, an unusual coalition of city officials, environmentalists, and farmers from the surrounding counties came together to form the now famous urban growth boundary. Now, while it has its critics today, that decision made Portland, Oregon one of the world's leaders in sustainable development 30 years later. So these three key ingredients are some of the things we learned from the urban trendsetters. But there's a fourth thing we learned, and it was unexpected. And I can't emphasize it enough. The solutions to the problems of the next America can't come from the urban trend-setting cities, at least not directly. This is the insight that led us here to Memphis, and it's here that I believe we can answer that third question my kids asked me that morning. Dad, is there hope for our country? It may be hard for some of us to sustain, but we believe there is hope, and it will be found in America's great underdog cities, and there's a reason. This is where most Americans actually live, and they more fully reflect those growing pains and fault lines than anywhere else. These are the cities that are on the front lines in ways that places like Portland, Oregon simply aren't. These are cities that already have a long and hard-won experience becoming majority minority, and in many of them, the distance between red and blue America is only a short commute. These are cities in which the problems are big enough that nobody in them suffers from the things are good enough here syndrome, and they're willing to step outside the box and be innovative. These are cities in which the scale and scope of the problems are such that anything that works in these places will work anywhere in America. Now, I believe from all that I have researched and all that I've seen that no city in America represents the promise of the underdog more than Memphis. Again, the problems are real. We all know the headlines. But there are already amazing things happening here. And the eyes of the country are beginning to pay very close attention to what happens in this city. Still, from an ecological perspective, from the perspective of the wolves, it seems clear to me that Memphis is just getting started, just rolling up its sleeves. Now let me tell you a few of the exciting possibilities that this outsider sees here in Memphis. Just imagine what would happen if the renewed potency of Memphis's civil rights legacy got hooked up in a serious way to the world-class know-how and human capital of its logistics industry. Imagine what could happen around racial disparities, innovation, and economic development. And what if both of those were in turn given expression by the extraordinary artistic and creative culture that gave birth to the blues and rock and roll? And what if all of that was powerfully connected to a citizenry who this last year made Memphis, Tennessee, the most charitable city in America? That would be an unusual coalition capable of a moonshot. In the same way that the Mississippi River, and now FedEx, has made Memphis the distribution hub of the country, there is no reason why a powerful combination of these assets couldn't make Memphis the civic solutions hub of the country. This is the promise I see in Memphis. So what will it take? From all that we've learned at Thriving Cities, I believe it will take a hope disciplined by ecological thinking and practice. Take a page from the Wolves of Yellowstone and think ecologically. Activate your anchor institutions. You have an amazing array of anchor institutions, from the University of Memphis to the National Civil Rights Museum, to the incredible faith communities and Shelby Farms Park, and a number of these that I'm just learning about. Build on these. Cultivate unusual coalitions. Nothing epitomizes this more than that incredible crosstown concourse redevelopment of that old Sears building in Midtown. It's trying to bring together in an incredible way public education, community health services, local foundations in an incredibly collaborative space. And it's all being spearheaded by a neighborhood arts organization. Nurture generationally minded leadership. Crosstown is nothing if not a generational investment. It took a decade to build. It will take a decade or more to fully assess its impact on Midtown. But it demonstrates Memphians' willingness to do the long-term thinking and investment necessary for lasting change. So while there may not be any one-size-fits-all formula for success, these are some of the things that have proven crucial time and again. And the good news for Memphis, and I believe for the rest of us, is that they're here in abundance, just waiting to be put together to realize their full potential. In thinking about that potential, both here in Memphis, but also in America's many underdog cities, I'm brought back to those three questions my kids asked me on that hot, violent morning. Dad, what's happening? We're going through the growing pains and the fault lines of America that is coming into being. And how we respond will play out on the streets and metros of our country. This is our grand challenge. Dad, what should we do? Well, I believe we should learn from the wolves of Yellowstone and invest mightily in the health of the human ecologies of our cities. Dad, is there hope for our country? Yes. But to find it, we will have to look to America's mighty underdog cities like Memphis, where the problems are real, but where a spirit of possibility and creative entrepreneurism exists in equal measure. At the heart of Memphis is a desire for hope and lasting change. If kindled, but also disciplined by ecological thinking, I believe you can light the way for the rest of us through the growing pains and across the fault lines of the next America into a more just and thriving future. Thank you.